You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I'm speaking with Barbara Phillips, who's been on our program once before, very briefly. Barbara, can you tell folks who you are?
Well, I'm 63 years old, and I am a performance poet. I've been a playwright also. I've written a couple of plays, and I guess I ended up coming into the mental health venue when I was about 34. So that's about 30 years ago. And it's been a bit of a journey on and off. Mm-hmm.
So for 34 years, your life went along tickety-blue. What happened when you were 34?
Oh, it was a postpartum thing. That was after my fourth birth with my daughter, and I was really frail, and I definitely wasn't embracing the rest and balance I needed at that time. So I ended up putting myself in a more vulnerable position than I needed to be, and as a result, I kind of flipped out. Yeah.
So when you say flipped out, what does that mean? What does that look like?
I mean, in that situation, and that's the one that I based my play Lost Marbles on. That was 94, 95. I ran across a room and I jumped into the baby bassinet. Like, the baby wasn't in there, but I just was expressing really strong feelings to some people who were guests in our house, as well as my husband. And the kids were all in bed, so gratefully they didn't get exposed to Mummy's meltdown. But Mummy jumped into the bassinet, and then, the next thing I know, I feel the strong arms of the ambulance attendants, paramedic people pulling me out and tying me to a gurney. And we lived about 5 blocks from Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster, and that's where I was taken. That was episode 1. Yeah.
So I'm going to go back. What was the strong feeling that you were feeling?
Oh, I think it's often people say, like, what does it feel like before you're in the hospital? It feels like you have no skin. It feels like you have no skin, like you have no ability to protect yourself from whatever's happening around you. And if it's a negative atmosphere, I can be really reactive when I don't have, peace of mind and balance, which was the case in that situation.
So you went to the bathroom, you came out, there were people in your house. Who were these people that caused you not to feel safe or that you had no skin?
No, I mean, it wasn't, I told you previously that the issue was spiritual abuse, and that's what I get into more in the play. And it's kind of like, I've kind of been like a weary voice on this to people who see the triggers of unhealthy spirituality and how it can flip people out. So they were those type of people. They were people who were in kind of a, what would you say, peripheral, there's a lot that goes with that, like people who feel like they're peripheral, but they feel they're cutting edge and that they understand the deeper things of the spiritual realm than anybody else. And they start to take liberties in terms of speaking into your trauma, and that's what these people were doing, right?
They were speaking into your trauma? I've never heard that phrase. What does that mean?
Well, I think most therapists do that. Like, they want to take you to that place of trauma and they want you to revisit it. And there's people in the church who also do that. They're like, okay, let's get this done. Let's get this done right here and now. And it may or may not be their place, and it may not be the right time. And so basically you've got people crossing into an area that they don't really understand. And particularly in the church with unhealthy people, there's some people who believe they have the market on the voice of God. So that's, that was kind of a compelling aspect. And it's like I had an allergic reaction to their presence in our home. It was like, and I was like, so I was yelling at them. And,
How did they end up in your home? What happened?
they were at our home because Roger had been a messy character for many years, and he was a guy who lived out of his truck, and he came to our house one day. He was all in tears, and he was like, "Oh, I think I'm going to straighten my life around. I met this woman named Kathy, and she's really cool, and we're going to try to have a good life together and move forward." And he's like, "Can I bring Kathy over sometime?" And Kevin and I were like, "Sure, come over sometime." But it really was the wrong timing for me. I just had a kid. I really didn't need to have people in my home at that time. And I didn't realize that his girlfriend, Kathy, she had certain ways of presenting that really don't work for me.
And these were the people that were in your house?
Yeah.
So, Barbara, tell me about your childhood.
Yeah, I'm fourth of 5 kids. My mom and dad, they were kind of alternative people. They were born in the early 20s, so they'd survived the Depression and the war. And after World War II, they decided that there had to be a change, a shift culturally, and so they were looking for options that would bring better peace and balance to the world. And so they were both members of the Canadian Communist Party, and they met there. And so as a result, they were kind of tagged by the McCarthy era, and they were blacklisted from the United States. And they were quite alternative. My mom was an art teacher in the school system in Vancouver, and my dad went through law school at UBC, and his law partner, at the time when he went through, he graduated in 1952. You had to be white to be a lawyer, and his law partner was the first colored person to be accepted to the bar in BC. So their practice was in Chinatown. And so I grew up with the Chinese community in Vancouver, and I really enjoyed how creative my mom was. And I also enjoyed, they both had come out of poverty. My dad had come out of the slums of England. So they were both very social justice oriented. And so from a young age, we were at all the, rallies against the war in Vietnam, and I liked that. I liked growing up in Vancouver. I liked being part of a voice, part of a voice about, we need change. And it's not all as, we need to challenge certain things in the system, and we love that about my mom. We all thought it was so funny because she weighs just over 100 pounds, and she's this tiny little woman. We all thought it was so funny that she got, interrogated by the FBI, and that our phone was tapped by the RCMP. We kind of delighted in the fact that because we were on the North Shore, and we were in kind of a upwardly mobile, neighborhood, and it was like my family never voted the way the masses voted there, and my family always was saying and doing things slightly differently, and I liked that. I was number 4 out of 5. I had 3 older brothers and a little sister, and at a young age, it was pretty apparent to my mom and to me also, though I didn't really want you're a kid, but I was excruciatingly shy. I was an introvert, and she noticed that in terms of creativity, I was always acting. I was always pretending I was a cat. I was always pretending this. I was always pretending that. So she put me in creative drama when I was about 5 years old, and I got involved with the Playhouse Theater School and things from the Arts Club Theater, and so I had a really nice growing up in those ways, having access to the arts, and my mom being an art teacher, she felt she was more inspirational getting other people to do visual art, but she was very, she was a good listener. Now, my dad, on the other hand, he had come as one of the homeboys from Britain, and that was it. He was put into one of those colony farms on Vancouver Islands where they basically took the poor of Britain to serve the upper levels who had come from the UK. And so they only gave them education to grade 8, and it was like a residential school. He came with an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old sister, and he was 12. And he was badly traumatized in that school. It was called Fairbridge Farms near Duncan, and that school was closed down because of the abuse against the kids there. And it was not a good outcome for my dad or for his two sisters. Like all three of them wrestled with alcoholism to a very acute level, and that was it. My dad wrote entrance for UBC Law, but he'd only had a grade 8 education, but he was a big reader. He had a very sharp mind, and he got in, but inside of him there was a war going on that never stopped with the Second World War, and his addiction really erupted like a crazy chaos into our family home. Like our family home was not a really safe place, you know.
Right.
Yeah, it was actually very scary sometimes. Yeah.
So you mentioned having postpartum. I'm not sure you finished that. Postpartum what?
When I was 34, when I ended up going into the psychiatric system, my first diagnosis was postpartum psychosis.
And has anybody else in your family had this? Or is this just completely out of the blue?
I don't think it's completely out of the blue. Like my mom, like she got polio when she was 4, and she went on to be a teacher. And her first placement in Seashell, the first year she taught, she was very passionate. She was really involved with her students, but it was a one-room schoolhouse. She was teaching all these grades. And at the end of the first year, I always think it's so cute because, you know, she basically had a breakdown, and she just felt she couldn't face the next day. But I said the beautiful thing about her breakdown is that there was no DSM. You know, it's like Betty's not doing very well. So she took a year off teaching, and everybody loved on her. And then the next year she got up again and went back to teaching and did well, you know, and stayed on course for about, 16, 17 years teaching in the Vancouver school system.
In retrospect, what would you have called that breakdown as if you applied it to the DSM now? Not that you're a therapist.
Yeah,
but what does it look like now?
Her breakdown, well, she married late in life. She didn't have her first kid till she was 35. I mean, in that day, that was late. What would we compare it to when someone wakes up in the morning and can't face the next day? I have a tendency, like I work with adults with special needs. I tend, and I was just talking to one of the parents, there's always specific diagnoses, but I tend not to look at people through that lens. Right. And it's the same with my mom. I just say, woohoo! There was no diagnosis put on you, nor did anyone say you need to be on XYZ drugs until you're in a coffin. Right. Like she was given a liberty that isn't really offered to us anymore. I mean, nowadays it's like the DSM is growing, and the number of medications, is happening, and they're considered to be the answer, right? It's like, that pill will make the difference, right? Right. That pill will be it. Yeah.
So, and you had 4 children? Yes.
I did, and that was my boneheadedness. I thought, if my little scrawny mom, she popped out 4 kids and then adopted 2, and I was like, look, if she can do that, I can have 4 kids. So it was just a basic boneheadedness on my account. And I like children. I think children, I don't know, the way they talk sometimes and the things they come up with, I'm like, hey, that's cool,
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
But it was after the birth of the 4th that you had difficulties.
Yeah, and actually, quite frankly, it was after the birth of the first 2 that I suffered from postpartum depression. Like I lost myself in that, and that depression, that was distinctly depression. But I felt like I'd had a really beautiful, active life. I'd worked overseas. I'd worked in the skiing industry. I'd run a backcountry lodge. I'd had a great time. But when I was at home with 2 little boys, both in poopy diapers, when they cried, it woke up a lot of my wounds from my childhood. So I was depressed, and there was no one to bail me out. My husband would come home and that, but it's like, oh my goodness, there's so much grief in me, and there's nowhere place to go with it. So that was prior to what was considered the psychotic rupture. 4.5 years later, 5 years later, whenever it happened.
So we're going to talk about that. when
Sure.
we come back. And we'll be right back, folks. You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm continuing a conversation with Barbara Phillips about her experience within the mental health industry. Barbara, let's go back to 1994 now, and you had a break.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we've talked about. That was my first hospitalization. I mean, I've been talking before, I was just a little bit of a high-strung kid. I was a little bit sensitive to a lot of stuff and, did suffer depression earlier in raising my kids. But after the birth of my daughter, I ended up, I hate the word triggered. I mean, it's like, am I going to use that word? But anyways, I flipped out. I was very run down. My eldest son was 6. I had a 6-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 18-month-old, and a newborn. And my newborn was 3 weeks old. And Kevin and I kind of have an open door, open house thing. We often, like, for people who are marginalized on the outside, it's like, yeah, you can come and drop by, you can say hi, you can, so we had some people come by and, I really should have been resting. I really should have been taking care of myself, but I didn't. And when this couple came in, they were religious. They had some religious ideas, and all of a sudden, I just kind of flipped out at them. All of a sudden, the really punchy part of who I was punched, and I ended up, yelling at them, and I was thinking, oh, this is crazy. What am I going to do? And I ran across the room. Our kids were all in bed, sleeping quietly, and I've gone into detail about what actually happened, or as much as I remember what happened, in a play I constructed called Lost Marbles, and which is basically based on that full year, Christmas 1994 to Christmas 1995, because it was a significant year of 3 hospitalizations. And on Christmas Day 1995, my mom passed away. So it was from a dramatic breakdown, which was diagnosed as postpartum psychosis. I ran across the room. I jumped into a bassinet. My husband called 911. Ambulance, paramedics, attendants came to our home. They took me out of the bassinet and tied me to a gurney, one hand above my head, the other at my hip. And I was kind of going in and out of marginal blackout. And I mean, I write about it I talk about it in my play, and I end up, we're 5 blocks from Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster, so I end up in Royal Columbian, and it was pretty shocking.
What do you think was causing the blackouts?
I think there's all sorts of types of nervous breakdowns, like where your system just doesn't want to go forward. I think, like for my mom, when she couldn't go back into the work venue, she just couldn't get up and get out of bed and on with the day. But I think this time, for me, this was more animated, what some doctors would call mania. And what causes that? I think some people are more vulnerable than other people to break. I think some people have thinner skin. I mean, I have 4 kids, and one of my sons is more vulnerable. And I just say to them, you know, the way I say to a lot of my friends who are vulnerable, we just have to navigate it. Like, we just have to, you know, if you recognize that you're on thin ice, it's like, oh, I'm on thin ice. But if you're not going to say to yourself, hey, I'm on thin ice right now, maybe I don't need to invite, you know, X amount of people over for a poker game, right? Like, you just say to yourself, no, maybe I'm not going to finish off that bottle of wine, like, because all of a sudden you're a bit punchy. Like, you might be doing and saying things that you wouldn't normally do and say because things are getting out of control.
So when that time that the paramedics came and they tied you up, why did they tie you up?
I don't know, but I was falling out of consciousness. I mean, I guess they had to get me from the home to the hospital. And then when I got to the hospital, they pick up people
all the time and put them in an ambulance. They don't tie them up. So why were you tied? Were you
I can't answer for that.
No. So you weren't doing anything overt that you know about that would mean that you were dangerous or anything like that. That was something that they chose to do.
Yeah, and I've had a number of admissions. That was the only time I was tied. Not saying that that's a good thing, but I'm saying I was tied. But when I got to the hospital, I was left in the corridor, and the male nurse who was overseeing, I said to him, look, the restraints are cutting into my wrist. Can you please loosen them at least? And he was like, no, Mrs. Phillips, we can't loosen them. So it's a system. And they weren't willing to loosen the restraints until there were 2 security guards there, and they were, needed to strip me, put me in the gown, and inject me with Haldol, and then put me into a seclusion cell. So that was their, now I know that's how they work, and I know, in 2020 I was back in the hospital again, and people were saying, oh, Barb, since you were in the mid-90s, it's come such a long way, and I found out, no, it hasn't. Exactly the same methods are used. So I was like, well, it's like, it is what it is. It's a system, and the system is built on fear and control, and so I ended up in my cell, and I will share with you that first time ever in my whole life that I was locked in a seclusion cell. And I wish it was my last as well, but no, because it is a handling technique, And that daughter of mine who was born that year, she's so cute because she's a nurse in Austria, and she goes, Mom, in Austria, locking people in seclusion cells is a violation of human rights. We don't do it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I get it.
And of course, we know the United Nations have said to BC that doing this is against the human rights. That and other things, forced drugging, and is against the human rights of people and the disabled.
Yeah.
So,
and it's still going on, because that is what I experienced in 2020, was forced drugging with medications that I had been told by previous psychiatrists I shouldn't be on, but
and that's not in your file that they could.
Well, that was the whole thing. Of course it's in my file because it was discussed, in 2014 with my psychiatrist. But that was in Kamloops when we lived in Kamloops. But now we live in Cranbrook. So it's just, there's very little connective tissue. And even though I say to them, excuse me, as of 2014, I'm not to be on antipsychotics. They have a negative effect on me. They damage my central nervous system. But because I'm the patient, the patient should be able to advocate for themselves, of course, but not in this system. You know what I mean? Because too often the patient's voice is made null and void. It's like, in 2020 it was COVID. We had to get people come in to correct the head nurse and the psychiatrist because they didn't have the imagination to hear what we were saying,
When you say we, is that you and your husband, or you?
Yeah, and also I had a mental health worker who was actually quite brilliant. She was very smart. So, that it was so funny because the two units, our town is small, like they're not even very removed from one another. And I'm like, so yes, we got her to come in alongside of my husband to say, look, this is who Barbara is. This is what she needs. This is what she does not need. Stop it. And it was funny. I mean, what's it called? Freedom of Information Act. I got my file, and so I got to read. Sometimes you're like, what the hey went on? Like, you need the backstory. Like, why are these people doing this to me, right? So, and it's funny because I read, I was let out in August, but then I read a write-up by the psychiatrist. He was so funny. He said, we stopped giving her antipsychotics, and miraculously she was healed. I'm like, that's so funny. You only did what you were supposed to do. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's like, what? I was not miraculously healed. You actually stopped abusing me with sedatives that were hurting me.
Isn't it funny that they have such preconceived ideas sometimes? Someone I talked to recently said that his father had been given electric shock without his consent for depression. And they gave him 9 rounds of electric shock and stopped there. And he went home. And from the electric shock, his depression worsened. And what they said was, we just didn't give him enough, so he needs to come back in and have more. So there's this attitude that it's not what we're doing, it's that, and it's not the medication or the treatment, it's always the client. The client is either worsening up despite their best efforts or miraculously getting better, just as you said. So it's really a strong bias that seems to happen out there.
Yeah.
So you're in the hospital. You're in the hospital for several months?
You mean at the beginning? The first time in 95? Like 94, 95?
I'm talking about what you were just referring to, being in
when I was in 2020. I was in as an involuntary patient for 26 days during COVID. So that's not months and months. That's less than a month. But to be an involuntary patient is not okay, because you're stripped of all your rights. Yeah. And then, during that time too, I mean, we've talked about that before, but I never was taken out for a walk, and it wasn't explained to me why they didn't believe that I needed to go for a walk.
What was explained to you? You're involuntarily picked up, taken to the hospital. I'm assuming you were drugged again. And the initial entrance into the hospital kind of sounds like it's the same in terms of you're there, you're drugged, you're stripped, you're put in isolation.
Actually, different. 2020 is quite different from 1994. 2020, I go off this is the whole circle of care things, but my husband panics in the middle of the night. We're having an argument, so it's like 2, 3 in the morning, and I come out from the bathroom, and lo and behold, there's 2 ambulance attendants and 2 RCMP officers in our very, very small house. And I'm like, what the hey is going on? Because my husband didn't preface anything. He just took some liberty. He thought, oh, Barb is whatever it called, decomposing or whatever. Because I had an agreement with my mental health worker that I was going to go drug-free. And I'd been drug-free for about 6 months. So then we were having this argument, and then his assumption is, well, she's animated in the argument because she's not on medication, right? So maybe we need to get her back to the hospital and get her on medication. So I didn't know where he was going with that. So I come out from the bathroom. There's these people there. And I'm like, so totally calm. It's like, I know how to be calm, right? So it's like, even though we had an animated argument, I'm not going to be animated now. And so they take my blood pressure, my pulse, the yada, yada, yada. And they walk very peacefully out to the ambulance. There's no handcuffs, nothing. Sit quietly upright in the ambulance, go to the hospital, sit and emerge. The nurse comes over. She's just an average nurse. She's not a specialist or a psychiatrist. But for whatever reason, she decides to make me an involuntary patient for 3, it covers so many days, I think 3 to 4 days or whatever. So she's the first one to do that.
And she did that based on what? Do you know?
Well, I don't know. She just, the whole, from what I've been taught or told is that you're an involuntary patient because you could harm yourself or you could harm the people around you, which is weird because I've never been suicidal and I've never lashed. I'm verbal. I have words, and I think in the 2020 time in the hospital there was a stressful moment there where I did tell one of the nurses to F off. But that got me pushed into the seclusion cell again. Like, you do have to watch your step. I lost my temper. I said, the F word, which, not proud of. It's not the best part of who I am. But I remember later talking to a woman, she's a high school teacher. She said, she said, we'd be locking kids in rooms all the time.
So I just want to get this straight. You weren't committed by a doctor. You were committed by a nurse?
Oh, no. It was a doctor, sorry. If I said it wrong, then that's my own fault.
That's okay. So it was a doctor that decided.
She was a doctor, and she committed me. And then when I got up on ward, it was, then once again, I was having difficulty communicating with some of the nursing staff, and then 2 of the psychiatrists signed me off as a committed patient then too,
Because
and I think it was
communicating in a way that they felt was...
Yeah, they didn't like, things weren't, it was COVID. There were different rules on ward. Everybody was kind of uptight, which they're uptight in the psych wards anyways. It's not as if it's a new reality, but I had my cell phone and I was taking pictures of flowers. There were some flowers in the garden, and I took a picture of another patient there, and then they said you shouldn't do that, and so I deleted it. But then after that they wanted to take my phone away, and I said, look, I need some contact with the outside world. So that's when we were having conflict. Right, so it was basically over communication.
Being somebody who's never been committed in this way, or having this kind of social construct around me, gratefully, or maybe I should say yet, it seems to me that you must get to a place where you start to get anxious if you're too mad or too happy or too excited, that people are going to mistake that for being crazy.
And they will. And it was funny because during that time that I was in there, I was sitting talking to one of the nurses, and she was saying, any elevation of emotion on your part, Barb, is part of your disease. And I said, well, you're going to have to leave my proximity then, because I'm starting to feel elevated emotion towards you. Because that's it. And also I think, I needed creative outlets too. So sometimes I'd get up really early in the morning and I would make soft sculptures out of clothing and towels and things in my room. And then I would take pictures of them, and then I would break them down really quickly because, for the staff, it's all sign of illness. And it is like that. And it is. I mean, when I got to that point in communication where there was a lot of tension and they locked me in the seclusion cell again, and then of course they triple dosed me with antipsychotics, and it was a pretty miserable place to be. Yeah. I said before that I was never, I'm not prone to be suicidal. That's not who I am, but I did despair. I despaired so deeply during that time, And it was at that time when they let me out of the seclusion, and I was asking the psychiatrist, I was saying, how many days before I can actually open my eyes again, because I was so heavily sedated. He said, well, 72 hours, 3 days,
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it truly is, and it doesn't happen to everybody all the time, but it happens to me because I tend to be a little bit assertive, and that's really frowned upon. And
to be assertive.
Yeah.
So advocating for yourself would be problematic because that would take being assertive.
Yeah.
Yes. We just need to take a little break, but we'll be right back, folks. Okay. You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm speaking with Barbara Phillips about her experience of the mental health industry. It's a no-win situation. It really is.
Not in the institutions, like not in the institutions. And I remember one time when, they had me on lithium for 20 years, and then it was doing in my kidneys, and so that was the same guy who took me off antipsychotics. But I was so angry because I'd been talking to them for 20 years to get me off lithium, and they weren't listening. And so finally, when he took me off, I was really angry because my body was being physically compromised, and so I was in the dining room, and I had a plate, and it had kind of like, hospital food on it, not very not very beautiful. But I remember I just took the plate and I smashed it on the ground, and I said, 20 fucking years. But it was great because there was a nurse there, and she was so nice. She was like, nobody touch Barb. She needed to do that. I was like, thank you, because totally the normal response would be trundled off, knocked to the ground, re-injected, do your time in the cell. I was like,
Barbara, what you talked about before is, I'm sure, shocking to some people. There's this attitude, and we often get told, if you're having a hard time, mental health is important, seek out help, reach out. What kind of treatment did you get in the hospital?
I would say I can barely remember, a positive situation. Although I did have a break when I was on Vancouver Island camping with my kids and husband, and I was taken into Cowichan District Hospital, and there they did not follow the quota. Like they did not do the stripping, injecting, locking. They did none of that. They talked to me the whole time like I was cognitive, which I was. So I remember thinking, wow, it's who's setting the tone here? Who's made a decision not to, to invest in all these angry reactions? Because I was, they call it pressured speech. By the time I went in, I was in that place of speaking kind of nonstop and cracking a lot of jokes, and but they laughed at my jokes. They were on my team.
Right.
Which is rare. But I would say, like, especially this 2020 lockup during COVID. Oh my goodness! When I came out of there, I said to my husband, "Don't let anyone phone. I can't answer a phone for a month." We live near a peaceful little lake in Cranbrook, in the Rockies, and I was out on the lake every day, just on my stand-up board and in our kayaks, and I just couldn't be around people. Like I had to let my skin grow back on my body. Now, in saying that, I have to say a phone call did come out of the blue, and I picked it up, and this guy goes, "I'm James," and I said, "Look, I've just been in the hospital. I've been traumatized. I don't know who you are." But he said, "James, I was in the hospital with you," and he had been kicked out of the psych ward, and he was homeless. He was going from where they're supposed to help you, and no one was helping him, and he was in tears. And I was like, "James, get in your car, drive here." And he came up here, and he was awesome. He was a chef. We made great meals. We had a good time together, and he stayed in our guest cabin, and he was just a wonderful person. And it was so good for me because there were so many damaging things that happened in the ward. Mm-hmm. And James knew the cast of characters. He knew because he'd been there too, and things that my husband can't fully relate to, James could relate to, so there's a little structure having James here.
So am I right in understanding then that your peer experience with James was more healing for you than the time you spent around people trained in mental health?
Absolutely. And I was so damaged from the beginning, like the Lost Marbles show, like the hospitalizations I had there. I remember, people say, "Whoa, you're going to need to be in counseling for a long time." I'm laughing. And I remember going to counseling, and then there's this woman, she's all trained in active listening, and I'm like, this is weird. This isn't like a real conversation, And I remember I came out, and there, there's this receptionist there, and I said, "That's weird. I don't know if I'm into this." And the receptionist said, "Do you have a friend?" I said, "Yeah, I've got some friends." She said, "Well, try your friends." And I've kind of been on that page. I actually have friends, and if you're not wearing them out too much, it's like, if you have a real friend, isn't that great? All these therapists, all these professionals, all these diagnoses, all these pills, but then there's a friend. It's like, and it's like, a friend, that's my prescription. I'm going to go find a friend, and I'm going to hang out with my friend, and maybe do something, maybe not do something,
Well, and that leads to this thing you talk about called the circle of care. Did this come out of your 2020 experience?
Oh, 100%, because boy, I was blindsided, but I think my husband was blindsided too. And oh my goodness, did it take me a while to forgive him for that? Because what we thought was happening, what he thought was happening, is Barb will just go back to the hospital because she's been off meds for 6 months or so, and maybe they're just going to reintroduce, on a low level, and just, he just thought it was going to be super low key, and it wasn't at all. It was incredibly damaging. And so we decided that no. Your significant other should not be phoning 911 without doing his own pulse check, without checking with your friend group. The circle of care is your friend group, and people who you trust. So the circle of care, I have about 4 people on it, and Kevin cannot phone 911 on his wife unless he has talked to hopefully all of those 4 people. And I get to talk to them too. So it's not just his insights, because it's like my sister says about my husband, he suffers from PTSD. Like he has fear factor going for him. He's like, Chicken Little, the sky is falling, whether it is or not, that needs to be determined, and I know even when there's been stressors in our marriage, I go stay at someone else's house, because I'm like, I'm not going to sit in a situation where they're going through their own stuff, but instead they overly focus on me, and they're a bit trigger happy, putting the spotlight on me, like, ooh, Barb's not stable. It's like, okay, just a sec. Who's not stable?
I think we live in a world that is fearful around mental health issues. I don't think we've managed to undo that. It's why they tie you up. It's why they give you Haldo, give you a chemical restraint if you're not physically restrained, and put you in an isolation room. Isn't that just because they're afraid?
That's exactly that. And then it can cause a lot of distortion in your intimate relationships. I mean, Kevin and I we're going towards 40 years. I can't believe that, 40 years married, but I didn't have my breakdown until we were between 8 and 10 years, right? So I know how fun it was when we were footloose and fancy free, and I want to hold on to that, and I don't want him thinking he has to have this crazy responsibility for who I am. Right. And also, we've noticed, me on a dominant level and him to a lesser, that the institutions have been acutely damaging to me as a person, and it damaging to him too, but in a totally different way, and I can't read his mind. I don't, I mean, he can guess on me as much as I can guess on him. But the circle of care is great. You get people who are, down to earth, who know you fully for who you are, and maybe know the strengths and the weaknesses. Like Kevin is not. My husband is not on my circle of care. And some people don't like that. They go, oh, I mean, he's known you for the longest, and you guys live together, and shouldn't he be on your circle of care?
We live in a social construct that has historically given husbands much more power over their wives. And we come out of a time when not too long ago, a husband who was just tired of his wife or didn't like how she cleaned or cooked could drop her off at the insane asylum, and that was okay. So I'm not surprised there are still people out there who somehow think that that husband should be the decision maker and the judge.
And parents can be that way too, because we see a lot of, and I've noticed that, so I said we've got 4 kids, and one of our sons was struggling more, and so there's this, it's kind of, I don't know, the lost boy syndrome, but then you've got these parents who they want to micromanage their kids in terms of getting them on certain medications, getting them into certain institutions, and freedom is really important. I can't stress that enough. Freedom is really important. So if you're going to say to someone, no, we're going to lock you up right now because we're not feeling safe with you. It's like better double, triple, keep checking before you pick up that phone and dial 911. Do not do that unless you really know what you're doing. And if you have a circle of care, like I do have 4 people in my circle of care, and it's on a little recipe card in my husband's wallet. It's in my wallet. Those are the people we go to before we go to any paid professionals in the psychiatric system, because actually we're not going there.
Right.
It's like, but it's like it's the parachute. It's the parachute.
And the circle of care, these are all people who are your friends, who know you, who will help others understand what's going on for you, like your husband. What have you empowered them to do? Is it just talk?
Yes. But see, that's the whole thing, the tyranny of the urgent, is that's why people end up, getting sprung into psychiatric. Actually, talking has its place. They would just talk. I think it's not only just talk. It's like there needs to be. That was 2020. I was last in, and we're coming up to 3 years since that time. But I'm about to send out an email to my circle of care saying, okay, do you still want to be on my circle of care? Are you willing to enter into dialogue? And part of that dialogue is agreement. It's like, we agree that Barb's fine, which I'm going to just say that because I really don't want any other verdict, right? Mm-hmm. Even if it's difficult, we can weather this, we don't have to put her in a place where she's going to be damaged, right?
I know that there are places in the United States that are creating peer respite houses where these houses are set up to take in people who are having difficulty so that they don't have to go to the hospital. And they are cared for, people surround them, make sure they have what they need, make sure they have the food they need and get the sleep they need, and just surround them and sort of in some ways not take their freedom away, but provide structure around them to make them feel safe until they no longer need that and can go back to their lives. And that is working for folks.
Oh, yeah. You're probably thinking of soteria and stuff like that. And I feel that that's what happened for me having James come up here. Because, there was a part of me that thought, I am so raw right now. I can't have anyone in my proximity because, I'm just too fragile. But boy, can we help each other out. Boy, can we help each other out. It's surprising to what degree that people who have been in the psychiatric system and been damaged by it can find other venues. And I'm grateful, in this, what I feel like has been a gazillion-year marriage to this guy, that there's people who I can go and over the years, it hasn't happened recently, but I can go stay at their home, and until the equilibrium in our home is healthier, right? Mm-hmm. Because if there's a dynamic, that isn't working, sometimes you need to unplug it and, it's like the computer, then go back to it later, it's like it's obviously not working
button.
now. Yeah, it's like, that wasn't very good. No, we're not going to do that anymore. So
right.
Yeah, no, I really, really strongly believe in peer support. And then, of course, you always have to, you always have to have your eye out for, I hated that book in high school, Animal Farm, especially with my
parents. Oh, I'm sorry, what was the name of it?
Animal Farm.
Oh.
Well, anyways, my parents were left-leaning, and it was basically like, communism came in, but then it brought its own, people oppress other people. Basically, that's the message, right? Mm-hmm. But the thing is sometimes we just need to have an awareness for that. There's a lot of people who that's not their go-to. That's not their go-to to to hold authority over other people in unhealthy ways. Mm-hmm. And those are the people you want to be working with people who are going through those fragile times, those times where, like I said, I don't feel like I have enough skin on my body. I feel like the ice is too thin. I think I'm going to go through, so right. I need to have people who are actually sensitive to that. And to put me in a prison cell, where I'm crying down the, whatever it is, the drain in the center of it, in a fetal position. No, this is not.
We're totally drugged out on some drug that doesn't allow you to think or process or do anything, really, other than keep your eyes shut.
Yeah. Oh, it's so funny. I felt like a Salvador Dali thing. You have put some toothpicks in there to keep them open, right? I was like one of the melting clocks. I was like the crazy landscape, eh?
So we need to stop here, Barbara. Thank you so much for this conversation. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to it?
No, it sounds good. It was good. I feel like, it felt good. Feels like what we need to say, and and
how are you doing now? We're in
I feel
2024. How's it going?
Oh, yeah, I guess we're in 2024. So yeah, I'm coming up to 4 years out of the hospital. I feel pretty good. I mean, because I went back to the hospital, I was put back on medication, and it's like, I said to Reed and Kevin, they both know. I said, I don't have long-term plans to. I do have long-term plans to eventually wean myself if I can, and I'm in a good space. And what I am taking now, I told you that before. It hasn't been comparatively, it hasn't been highly damaging to me, which of course means a lot to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would mean a lot to anybody.
Well, after that 20 years, 20 years, and that's what I said, I raised my kids highly sedated, and the robbery of the quality of life is, I feel for the whole situation. I feel for all of us, and I'm really grateful because actually, my youngest one is 29 and my oldest is 36. It's really positive. It's really positive, so I'm really grateful for that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've got other relationships in my life that are not so positive, but yeah, spouse and kids is pretty good, and my siblings is okay. Yeah, so I'm like, well, you can't please everybody. Just do your best.
That's all we can do. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay.
Okay, and we'll be right back, folks.